Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Alpha Anywhere Demo and Q&A webcast for 2021 series. I'm Dave McCormick, VP of Products and Services here at Alpha Software. I'm pleased to present Dion McCormick, no relation, but great last name, who's our lead solutions engineer. Also joining us, Sarah Mitchell, also no relation, but you probably assume that, in charge of our documentation department. So today, Dion has got a presentation that I think you're doing something with lists today. Did I get that right?
Yep, a new feature in lists.
A new feature. Oh, I know exactly what it is, but I'm not going to spoil it. In fact, let's just get started. Of course, we're also here to take your questions. You could type those questions into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel. So, Dion, I see that you're already presenter. If you want to go ahead and share your screen.
And sharing, always about the sharing.
It's always about sharing is caring. Yeah.
Hey, thank you, Dave. Thank you, Sarah, for being with us so that when I inevitably screw up, Sarah is there to clean up the mess and really tell everybody how it actually is done. You know,
how it's supposed to be done. Exactly.
I'm like Inspector Clouseau. You know, it just kind of.
It all works out in the end, though. It's fine.
Yeah. So so thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. We are here for you. And in fact, this presentation today was triggered by an email we got. Actually, I've got two things I want to cover. That and a embedded grid filtering question that we came in. Talk a little bit. We call it power searching. Power searching is really cool. And it's a neat feature because it's really easy to implement. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. And more importantly, if you have any questions, go to your GoToWebinar Q&A area and put in your questions. The team will be monitoring that as we go through our presentation. The questions can be on obviously the topics here, or if you have other subject, we're glad to hear them. And remember, you can always submit things at guides@alphasoftware.com, which will allow us to do a little homework and be prepared to talk to you. So in essence, that's what is today about. So today I'm going to talk about a user interface capability. And one of the most powerful components, and probably the most powerful component, is the list control in the UX. It does so many different things. It's like it's kind of like the Swiss Army knife of components or controls in the alpha world. It does display, it does data synchronization and management. It now has presentation for Kanban and calendar, and it's like a whole system in and of itself. So one of the key capabilities is the display of information. And what we're focused on really heavily, is the ability for you to recreate and have fantastic user experiences for your users. So use all that power to make it look and act and work the way you can to make your life easier for users. And very, very important, as you get a lot more data in your system and you're using that information, there are some critical capabilities that we've added to make it easier. And the other kind of aspect is we want to make sure that you can use the list control, because the list control is really, it's modern, it's responsive, it's mobile oriented. So it's really where you want to go and kind of do your work. Still use the grid, and in fact, we'll show a demonstration of that today. But again, if you're starting out from scratch, definitely look at using the list control because of all the cool features and capabilities it brings you once you get your hands around it. So I'm going to do a quick demonstration of what's called the fixed columns capability. So let me jump into that and show you that, and then we'll have another Q&A question that came in over the guides that we'll go through from there. So I'm going to go into my development environment here, and I've already created a UX with a single list control. So this list control is data-driven. It's basically talking to our Northwinds backend database, and it has a really cool feature. I'm going to go ahead and hit working preview to show you this feature. So you'll notice in here that the list control has the ability to do what are called fixed columns. So you'll notice we have customer ID, contact name, title, address, city, fax, but you'll notice we have down here a slider bar. And if I move the slider, you'll see that as I move it across, it's actually showing more information on the right. And so as I move that through the situation, you know, it's going to the right, takes a moment because of the lag time here, but it's showing more data. This is really powerful because you may have a fairly small interface with many, many columns, maybe 20 or 30 columns. And this allows you to freeze columns at the first and the last, and then have it so that you can kind of slide it. Now, you've probably seen this behavior in Excel. It's been a long time. You can freeze basically header and column rows and our columns, and this basically replicates that capability. It's very nice. Again, when you have a high level of information in your system, you may have 20, 30, 40 rows. You're trying to show them a lot. If you start scrolling over, you don't want to lose that first column because that's the key of your information. So you want these columns in the middle. And you'll notice we have a frozen column here and a frozen column here. And as I move them, these stay the same, but these switch through the process. And this is called the fixed column capability. And it was just recently added. And the neat thing about it is it's really simple to implement. It doesn't take a lot of work, if any work at all. It's just really a matter of deciding it. And more importantly, there's a lot of ways you can go in and modify it to make it look and feel different ways. So let me go ahead and show you how that's done. So I'm going to go back into my design. You're going to notice I only have a single component in my UX, or a single control, which is the list control. By the way, when I added it, I went ahead and went to add control and typed in list and then added it to mine. Once I added it to mine, I'm going to go ahead and double click on this to open it, but you could go over here and click this list properties. That also opens it up from there. So now I'm in the list editor. So, I guess I use static data for this. So you can either use SQL or anything, but in this case, just to make it simple, because I can also send it out to everybody to check out and be able to see. So I'm just using some static data. And you can see here are all my different columns of information: contact name, title, address. And you see it's just sort of a delimited, this isn't JSON, but it's a delimited set of information with that situation there. So then I have my list layout, and I use my normal list layout functionality to say what order do I want to see these columns. So I went ahead and ordered that. Now, everything up to now is kind of plain list control building. You create the list, you connect it to data, you display what items you want. But now there's a nice new feature that will allow you to then enable that frozen capability. So we go here to list properties, click there, and I'm list properties. I'm going to scroll down. And down here, a little bit farther, it has under the layout properties. Now, if I needed to find this quickly, by the way, and this is enabled in all of the different essentially builders, you have this little button here called properties. So if I'm at the top and I go, you know what, I forget the name of that. What was that named? And you kind of guess it. You can click here, instead of going scanning through it, which I did, you can click here and go fixed. And you'll notice that it's basically filters down to all the different properties that are available. And that's the thing, is over time, we get so many different properties because every little property allows you to modify the look, feel, behavior of the system. So you'll notice here we has fixed virtualized columns, and it's in the layout properties section. So I'm going to go ahead and click find property, and it takes me right there. So you'll see that under here, we have the has fixed virtualized columns, and it's really just an enable. You can turn it on and off by clicking this checkbox. Now, when you click that checkbox, it's going to show you a column setting. This allows you to go in and make some modifications to that column. So let's go ahead and click that. And you'll see when I do it, it opened up a fixed virtual column properties. And this is where I can kind of tell Alpha, how do you want that list to be working? I mean, what do you want to do in terms of that list? So first and foremost, you tell it how many columns are you going to show? And you can modify that. And that may be different. If you're using more of a compact theme, you can add more. If you're using a more mobile theme, you're going to have less. But you can tell how many actual columns do you want to show. You can also tell it how do you want to do what's called the scroll control. That was what was below that button down below. We have a slider, which is the default, but we also have a scroller, which is a different method. I'll try and demonstrate that in a moment, which is a little different animal. So it just gives you a different user experience so you can identify which one is better for you. And then you can also tell it where do you want this scroller. So in this case, it's at the footer, so it's at that bottom of my list, but the other option is in the header, which may be beneficial, is that you kind of want it at the top of your screen. Up to you in terms you want that, where you want that from going. Now, here are the key aspects in terms of what is going to be locked. So first, you have lock columns start of list and end of list. Now, notice we don't say left or right because a list could be vertical or horizontal orientation. It really has a lot of flexibility in terms of how you lay it out on the screen. So the left would be, in our case, the start would be on the left, and the end of the list would be on the right. Conversely, if you're using a vertical list structure, it could be above or below kind of scenario. So you can see first it's asking you how many columns you want to lock. So you're not limited to one. So let's say you had, a record ID and a couple other pieces of data that you always wanted them to see. And then you wanted to then have the rest be floating. But also cool is you can lock them at the end. So maybe you have like a totals, like maybe there's a total, like let's say you had a list where, it had like the customer, their company, January through December, and then a total column. Well, you may want to take the first couple columns, which is the company, the customer and their company name to be locked, and then at the end of the list, you want to have that total. And then in the middle, you're just kind of scanning through the months of data that are associated with that. So you can see from even like an accounting perspective, it really makes for a nice user interface. It's what people are used to dealing with, especially when they come out of the Excel world. And a lot of people are very Excel centric just because that's been a tool around forever. And they tend to be using that kind of scenario from there. So you can adjust these as you see fit. Once you've done that, you're good to go. When you run your list, you'll see, let me go ahead and just rerun it real quick to show you that. Go into this. So you'll see here's my first column. I've locked one column. Here's my last column. I've locked one column there. And then I have my columns in the middle with my slider down below. So let's make a few little changes just to kind of experiment with this. So I'm going to go back into my list builder, and I did that by double clicking on list one. I'm not going to change the list layout, but I'm going to come in here and go down to my fixed columns area. And let's go ahead and set 2 columns here. So maybe I want 2 there. And let's make this thing at the header. So I'm just making a few changes here. So now we'll go okay, do a working preview. And in a moment, you'll see now we have 2 columns here that are fixed. And then we have our slider. And as I move my slider, as it renders it, you'll notice these columns stay fixed, but these here are moving based on my slider being moved different ways. And so it's a little clunky here just because I'm working in my working preview, but it's got a very smooth process that goes through it from that standpoint. You'll notice my facts, which could be like a totals column, stays there. And again, I purposely used a mobile interface because I wanted to really make sure that only a few columns be. And so we'll go back to design. Let's just take one other change that I'd like to go into list properties. Go in here. And instead of slider, let's try a scroller and let's see what that looks like and just show you what that looks like from there. And anybody who deals with lots of data who comes from a spreadsheet world are going to love it. When you show this to people, they're going to be like, yes, that is the way to go. So you'll now notice instead of that big slider up or that big kind of round scroller button on top, you have this right here, and you can use that to click on it and move it over. And it even gives you kind of telling you what is the first column that will be shown. So you'll notice it's doing 2 things. It's moving the columns, leaving the fixed columns alone, but you'll notice also below it says city postal code. It's kind of showing you, address region, which one are the ones you're going to see. So the person, if it's like 30 or 40, they can quickly go across till they see what they're looking for, hit it, and then it will go to that location in their horizontal list. So that's called the fixed list columns. Again, super simple to implement. It's really, really nice for large data sets and people who are Excel oriented, and a lot of flexibility. You can kind of play with it. The styling is available. So for instance, let me go into it real quick into list properties, fixed list. You notice like the colors, how wide they are, the width, and other things like that. And each of these things here has a description down below that tells you what it means to change. So you can adjust all these things you want, and you can even include your own classes. So if you even want different styling for things, you can do that from there. So that is called the fixed virtualized column settings. And if you have any questions on that, let me know, and we can take those. Otherwise, I have another demonstration that came in from a question from someone I'd like to cover since they took the time to email us. But
So there
let's see if
is
we have any questions.
one quick question, which is, can the number of columns be set programmatically?
At this time, I don't think so. I'd have to check on that, but I haven't seen that in the notes. I can see where that'd be very valuable, where the user could lock certain columns and do that. But I
Sure.
haven't seen that, so I'm not sure.
Okay, thanks.
But a great feature request, which, by the way, if you have a feature request on your web projects control panel, go to help, send an enhancement request, and that will automatically recreate an email with all the right place to go to, etc. Click on that, put in your request, and send it in. And that's watched very, very closely by the team, because obviously the greatest ideas come from the people who are actually using the tools out in the field.
And that's it for questions right
Oh,
now on that particular feature. Thanks.
dynamite. So now what I'm going to do, and I can send this if you're interested in a copy of this, I'll provide that so it can be sent out from there. So I'm going to do another quick demonstration. I'm going to go ahead and just do it in here for right now. So first thing I want to do is I'm going to create a grid. So I'm going to create a grid component. Back to the future. So my query, I'm going to select here. I'm going to select my Northwinds database, and I'm going to select my customers. There. Pretty straightforward. I'm going to go to my fields, and I'm going to show a few of the fields. And I'm going to make this, yep. So boom, done. That's grid is really nice. So similar to the list, you do boom, boom, and it's got all the capabilities there. So let's call this, and we'll go customer_grid. Okay. So that's a grid, standalone grid, but I want to use that in conjunction with other things. So I'm going to actually go back to my web projects control panel. I'm going to go here and click UX component. And I'm going to create a UX component. I'm going to leave it really simple. I'm not going to use one of the inbuilt-in templates, but you could do that if you'd like. So I'll select that. Okay, we have our base template. And then what I want to do is I want to have the ability to embed that grid. And that's kind of a cool feature. You can embed grids and UXs in other ones, which really allow you to create very complex interfaces and very dynamic ones from there. So in my case, I'm going to have something pretty simple. I'm going to have a drop-down box. So let's go ahead and click here. And I'm going to put in a drop-down box, and I'll call this customer. So this is just going to be a simple drop-down box that basically, has a list of customers in it. So I'm going to go ahead and select that, and I'm going to go over here to choices. And what I want to do is have that database driven. So instead of me creating a fixed set of customer information, managing that, I just want to read that data out of the database. So I'm going to click here for choices. You'll notice I have static, dynamic, variable. I'll go here to dynamic. And very similar to how I set up my grid, I'm going to select my connection string. I'm going to do my select statement, which is basically how do I find it. So what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to say I want to go from the customers table, and I want to display the customer name, our company name. But actually what I want it to do is select the ID of that company. Now, if I do this, then this basic control will be whatever company name you select. But in my case, I want it to actually behind the scenes set the customer ID. So if I select a certain customer, the field will display the company name, but the actual value for that field will be the unique ID, in this case, of customer ID. Now, if I preview the data, you'll see here's my company name and its associated customer ID. And a kind of a trick just to let you know is that I'm using the simple builder, the Genie, but in Expert, you can go in here, and this is the actual SQL statement. You can do things like concats and other tricks to like sort of enhance the presentation of that data in the drop-down box. And this explains a little bit more of how you can do that. So the reality is I tend to use this all the time, but if I have to do something special where I want to like take the first name, last name, and dash them together as the value to be seen, I can use standard SQL to do that here. But I'm going to leave it the same, so we're just doing there. Right, so let's go ahead and we'll go like this. I'm going to go, let's go customer UX. Okay, so let's show a little quick working preview. And you can see there is my customers. And you'll notice it's again showing the company name, not the ID of the customer. Now I want this to be compact, so I'm going to go over here to properties, and then at the very top we have our style and compact. So I wanted to match my grid. You'll notice when we ran the grid, it was in a compact theme versus a mobile theme. So I want them to be similar. So it's sort of a cohesive scenario there. Now let's go back into working preview. And again, you'll see we have that. Now you'll see it's kind of a little more dense representation. And when I select something here, it sets the value of this field as that customer ID. Now I'm going to go into my controls here. And what I want to do is this customer grid here, I want to actually embed that in this customer UX. So I'm going to go down here to other controls. By the way, I could just click add control. I'm still getting used to that. It's newer. So I'm just so used to knowing where they are after time. But we have embedded object. So I'll select that. And then it's asking me, what do I want to embed in my UX? And you'll see actually there are two things. One is, does the object display when we initially display it, or do you show it when user clicks a button? Usually I have it already displayed, but it's up to you on when you do that. Now it's asking me, what am I actually going to insert in there? And as you can see, I can insert many different things in this page, in this embedded object. So I could insert what we're going to do today, a component, which could be another UX, or it could be a grid. I could put in a report, an A5W page, some static HTML, and a whole external page, maybe a whole, like pointing to another website, or even a PDF document. And as you see now, we've talked about the PDF view. There's better ways to do that, but that's capable within the system. But I'm going to stick with component because what we want to do is display that grid. So I'm going to click component here. Now you'll see it's giving me a list of components. The one I want is customer_grid, and I click OK. So now what that's done is it's embedded that object. And I can have more than one. I can embed 2, 3, 4, 5. It's up to you. It's pretty neat on how that goes. And the embedding is happening automatically. You don't have to worry about triggering it, etc. You do have a lot of control over that. You can modify, like for instance, you can dynamically embed stuff and do everything else. You can also tell it how you want it to embed. The default is AJAX callback, which means the following. When this UX loads, it's going to make a call to the server and say, hey, guess what? I've got this embedded object. It's called customer_grid. Could you send that to me? And I'll go ahead and render it for the person. So that's called AJAX callback. And one thing that's really cool about that is that happens each time they load up this UX fresh in their browser. So if you go make a change to grid, the next time they do it, they're going to get a new grid representation. So there's some cool maintenance capabilities there. But you also have options to say pre-computed. That means if you're going to publish it like in a standalone app on a mobile device, you're not really, and it's going to be offline, you may not have that ability to call back and get that information. So you need to basically tell it to pre-compile it, kind of pre-embed it before it gets into there. And then there's also an option where it'll look locally, but if it's not, it'll go up there. And then there's also dynamic, which is another way you can control programmatically how to do this stuff. But I'm just going to keep the default, which is called AJAX callback. So I'm going to save this now and let's look at it. So you can see immediately it did two things. First, it loaded up the customer, but then you saw that little GIF, that little wait GIF. And what it was doing there was making a call back to the server, that AJAX callback, to say I'm going to re-render, or I'm going to render this grid in my UX. But it's consistent. You don't see big boxes or anything. It's just now embedded. And if I had other embedded stuff, it embedded here. And you can use things like panel cards and other stuff like that to control the structure and styling. Pretty easy, pretty straightforward in terms of this capability. Now, the real trick, and where the question came from, this has all kind of been a long, boring setup to the reveal, which is, hey, you know what? I've got this grid. When someone selects here, I want to select the record in here. So this is going to select the same table, but realize this could work for, if I have another table, let's say orders table, I could look on that, and we can actually demonstrate that in a minute if we want. But the idea is when I make a selection here, what I want to do is update this to only show records that are somehow related to this drop down here. Now, normally you think, oh, okay, I've got to write some JavaScript and it's basic callback. I got to re-render the grid. I got to do this. I got to set arguments and stuff like that. But the answer is no, that is all not necessary. This is far more simpler than that. And it uses a really neat, powerful capability called linking, or more importantly, live linking. And they actually coined this as power searching, because this is great where you had 5 or 6 controls against a large data set, and you wanted to say filter it this way. It's doable within that, and that's called live linking. So now I can go to design, and what I want to do is this object right here, I want to link to customer. So on the right-hand side, you'll see in our properties right here, we have a component name. It's telling us the type. We have what's called an alias, and then you have a base filter, user filter, and link. So the first thing, and this is the most important thing to remember, is when you use live linking, which I'm going to demonstrate here, you want to give the component a specific alias. If you're not doing any linking, you can just ignore this. Not really necessary. But if you're going to do this live linking, you actually have to say, don't give it a default where alpha would create that name. You get to create that name. So I'm going to go ahead and click here on the ellipsis next to this component alias. And here's the name. I usually just give it the same alias. And this is important because you might have 2 or 3 customer grids and you could have different aliases for each one. It kind of helps the system differentiate the different pieces of components that are available. So when it does the work of writing the code to do the updates, it does that for you. So now we have customer grid. Now we have this link component here. And so I'm going to go ahead and click here. Now, base filter is interesting. I would like to cover that for a moment. Let's say when this customer grid comes up, you only want to show a subset of data. Well, what you can do is in here, you can create a filter, and that filter will automatically filter out those records no matter what's in that grid. So it'll create a subset of those records to be seen. So that's kind of nice from a security standpoint. You can create those base filters to say only show certain things in here. Similar with user filter, this, by the way, the base filter cannot be removed. It's kind of like hard coded into the UX, into the embedded grid. So there's no way for the person to do it. But with user filter, the user filter can be removed if the user executes a show all command. So, and then what's going to happen is it's going to filter it on both of those filters together. So some pretty flexible stuff in terms of doing it. And the list control has something very similar to that, actually even more flexible than that, but this is kind of there. But what I would rather do is something called link. So base and user filters, you kind of type them in and they're kind of coded into your user interface. But in my case, I want other controls on the screen to drive that filtering process. So I'm going to go here to link. I'm going to go ahead and open that up. And you'll notice it reopens that grid genie, which was where we put our alias in here. So what I'm going to do is, there's an explanation here, but I'm just going to click link. And what I'm going to do is this gives me a little, I'm going to click here, and it allows me to do link mapping. And it's linking the target grid with the field. Actually, more importantly, it's linking what's inside the target grid with what's on the field. So in our case, I'm going to click and add a field. Notice you can add multiple fields, which is really cool. So let me click add field. So which field am I looking? And notice this is telling us in the target grid's primary table. So it's actually asking me what data in embedded object customer grid do you want to select? So I'll go customer ID. On the right-hand side, it's asking me, well, what filter or what field on my component do I want to map to that customer ID? So in our case, we only have one here called customer. Now, very powerful, you could set a JavaScript function. So if you want to do some manipulations or other things, a lot of flexibility built into it. We're going to keep it very simple, and most of the time that's good enough. But if you get into a situation where you go, you know what, that drop-down field, I have to do a couple other things, and then I want to link it, you can do those kind of things from there. So now you'll notice we have a target field of customer ID in my embedded object grid. And on the right-hand side, we have source, which is the customer dropdown. And I'm going to click OK. So now we've linked those two together. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, save it, and let's do a working preview. Okay. So you can see there's no records in there. And if I change it, nothing's happening. Okay, now let me explain why. First, when I loaded this up, it was empty. So therefore, there is no linking customer ID. It's not going to show. The issue is when I move here, when I select here, I want to be able to refresh this grid to show the only information that I require. Now, Before, you would have to write a little JavaScript and monitor this on the on-change event, but actually built into it is another more powerful feature called live link. And basically when you enable that, Alpha adds all of that monitoring or watching functionality to take care of that for you automatically. So you don't have to write any of that code. So I'm just going to click here and say live link. Now, very important, if you had not set the component alias, it's not going to let you do a live link because it needs to, when it generates all the JavaScript and everything for this to happen behind the scenes, which to be honest, you don't have to care about because it's done by it, it needs to have a defined component alias for that to work. So now we can go to working preview. Okay, same situation. Notice no customer in here, but now watch when I modify this, what happens. When I select it, it does two things. One is it tells this grid to refresh, but more importantly is behind the scenes, it writes the little SQL query against the grid saying show only things that match bottom dollar markets kind of situation here. And so the cool thing about that is notice I didn't have to write any code and it works and it's fast. It's doing queries against the database and updating all that. And your grid will do all the representation from there. And that's the concept of live linking. You just have to make sure A, you have a component alias, 2, you say link. And remember, I have a single field here, but I could have 3 or 4. So if I'm doing more of a filtering of saying filter by country and then filter by zip code or postal code, then you see that subset. And what's cool is I currently used a drop down in here, but that could be a text field, it could be a slider, it could be many different types of fields because it's going to be smart enough to take that field information and figure out how to do the filtering against it. And that's the way it goes from there. So that's called live linking. And this was the question that came in. I hope that gives the person pointers on helping them get their solution going there. We really appreciate you adding that in there. And at this point, I guess I'll just open it up for questions on this. This has been around for a bit, but it's really simple and easy to use. And again, there's an equivalent capability with the list control they're called search fields there, to do something very similar. So you're not going to give that up if you use lists. You'll have that same capability. It's just oriented a little differently.
Great. So yeah, a couple of questions about embedded objects and specifically embedded components. The first one is there a performance impact by having the using an embedded component versus putting all those same controls right into the main UX that you're using?
There's the slight performance is that it has to dynamically load that, which is, a pro and a con. So if you just want the whole thing to come down and show up at one time, then yeah, you'll get a better performance if you have everything in it because Alpha will pre-compile all these pieces and make it happen. But the other real benefit is it allows you to break your larger programmatic units or components into smaller chunks and make it easier to manage. Because like if I want to change this grid now, I just go into the grid and make my modifications there. And then the next time this loads up, it's going to have those capabilities in it. So it allows you to kind of start breaking your application down into smaller pieces. And also, if we're using the dynamic capability, like I noticed that when I load this, this automatically loads, you can control that. There are ways for you to say, hey, you know what? Don't show the grid until someone has done something like selected a filter. And actually, you might see a improved performance because the screen will just pop right up because it doesn't have to load the stuff. But then they'll see a little wait time as it refreshes the embedded grid or embedded UX from there. And that is a benefit because you'll see the customer UX is about 200K, and that's all that would load if you did, in our case, it's a little bit larger with the customer grid, but you can control that process to say, and you can do that with lists, by the way. Lists are much lighter weight to let you know. Those are much better as far as performance and other things like that. But this is really simple for you to be able to break your app into multiple pieces, manage them as little individual pieces, and handle it from that standpoint. So bit of a performance, but yeah, trade-offs. You could actually get around that. It could actually look better than what you have now. And it makes your UX now doesn't have like a bajillion things in it.
Right. Yes, it's certainly easier to maintain. And I suspect that there might even be components that the user may not need necessarily, or only needs occasionally. So having to wait to load those would make sense versus making everyone wait while they load a
Yeah.
piece they might not necessarily need.
And just to let you know, I kind of embedded in here, but
Mhm.
there are action JavaScript that that allow you to open up other components on the fly. So for instance, you could have like 5 buttons, and when they click a button, it would go load that UX component into your current UX component. And therefore you could programmatically control it, and therefore you'll get really good speed, because you may have 20, 30 UX components doing a whole bunch of different things. No reason to load that all into the user at once. And as embedded, you could actually have ways of just saying, no, when they click on this button, then show it to them then. So you get that kind of small hit as it loads it up there. But from a perceptual standpoint, the system is up and running, and then it just adds things as it goes.
Terrific. Okay, so now a question about lists and about data sources for lists. When you are setting up a list, you get to choose the different types of data sources, and you use static in your case. The question is, if you're doing SQL, can you use views? Apparently, it looks like only tables are being listed there,
No,
if I'm reading this
you
correctly.
should be able to be used. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's go ahead
Okay.
and I'm just going to demonstrate this. I'll create a new UX component, the old school low weight. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and add a control, list control. Okay. I'll go list customers. Now I can go through the setup gene, but I'm just going to click OK. Normally you want to use the setup gene. It makes your life a lot easier. So now I'm going to go in here, and the first thing we're talking about is data source. So I can click SQL here, and there are really 2 ways to load data from a SQL data source, either through a list of fields from a table or view, or custom, where you can create a custom query to pull that data in from there.
Oh, okay.
And you can use stored procedures and stuff. There's some tricks to do that. But if I go to connection string and add this, then I go fields from table and I open up there. Up here, you'll see it's showing just tables, but notice my selectors up here. I can click
Oh,
views.
yep.
Now it's showing the views. So I can go
I
against
see. So
either
by
one of
default,
those.
they're hidden, perhaps, but
Yeah.
if you want to see them, you can, and you can certainly use them. Now, my understanding is you wouldn't be able to update a view. Is that correct? I mean, views are literally just for
Yeah.
viewing. Yeah.
Potentially you could, but I found that views are very problematic.
Okay.
There, and it depends on the database you're working with. And, it's like catch as catch can. So what I usually do in that situation is that if I have on a particular view, you can do it 2 different ways. One is you could use the view for the grid for the list component, but then have um, another UX that actually does the editing. That's one way I've done it before. And again, you can make it look like it's happening all in the same UX with the embedded UX component. It could be either a data bound UX, or it could be another, or it could be a hidden list with a editor. So there's different ways to do it. Also within the view, let me go ahead and just grab something here. Within here, no, I've got to actually add those. But yeah, generally I don't do that. But in views, you can actually do things like um, custom control, where you can dynamically create stuff on the fly. Those are nice. The other thing too is that if you have parent-child relationships, like let's say you have company or like client, and one of the columns is a foreign key to a company table, you can use in here the ability to use what are called they're called computed columns. And what computed columns are is it can say, for this column in this list, go look at this other list of company names and IDs and replace it. So you may be able to pull it off by having that capability instead of creating a view. And then the nice thing is then you have an editable list with, because you're off of a table, but you can replicate that view capability using what's called, it's called lookup columns, not computed lookup columns. Because what it will do is when you put a lookup column in there, it will say, oh, okay, here's the company ID. Actually go look up in the company list and display the company name in the list, not the ID. But the underlying list is still built on a table. So therefore, if you do any editing and things like that, that will all work. So that's called lookup columns. So obviously tables are first, second is use compute lookup columns, but if worse comes to worse, you can create a list off of view, but then when you click on something, you might want to have like another UX or something that's bound to the actual table to do the editing there, because you're right, certain views can be edited or updated, but a lot of times no, because the complexity, it doesn't know how to apply all those edits to the right spots. So
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so this one is about arguments. Are you ready for an argument?
yes,
Excellent.
angry arguments.
When creating an argument, I said there, and they select the get value from the current logged in user. They select a value. Their question is, can they refer to that argument value anywhere in their UX? Is an argument, does that get passed around like a variable from place to place?
Yeah, the way I see arguments is think of them as server side, although there's a really cool caveat on that, server side UX variables. And they're persistent, meaning you set them, they stick. They're part of the UX. So remember, arguments are done at the properties level of a UX. So let's just go ahead and find arguments here. So you go into arguments, you create an argument. Let's just do one here. Let's say customer ID. Important, you tell it what type, because then that gives Alpha a lot of way of how to use it for doing different things here. Now, you can get an argument from runtime. You can get it from a variable. You can even call XBasic to it. So there's a whole bunch of different ways you can load up this argument. But the beauty is once you've loaded up that argument, it is now part of that. So let's just go ahead and actually let's do, like this is current logged in user. That's a neat feature that if you've enabled that at the project level, you have a table with information about the user and it'll go look that information up, like their region ID or whatever it happens to be. But I think I'll just use right here and I'll set it by saying the argument look at list customers. Okay. So now we have an argument, and that again, that argument is called customer ID. So the cool thing about that is first and foremost, if I go to server side, it puts in this sample code, and on lines 6 and 7, it tells you actually it's 7 and 8. If I want to get the current value of an argument in XBasic, I can actually just emit this and put that argument name in it. So if I have like an XBasic callback, I can actually look up that argument and say, what is the current value of that argument? And Alpha will make sure that argument is up to date with whatever destination is to it. The other is that if you want to, you can actually even in XBasic set the value of that argument. Now you got to be a little careful is that if the argument's bound to a field or something, then it's potential that it's going to get overwritten by the system. So you have to be a little, but if you have arguments that you're managing, you can do it there. So you can read them, but you can also write them. And again, this is XBasic, so this will happen on the server side. So when the argument is set, then in your XBasic callback, you can go into an argument and say, hey, give me the value of that argument, and I'll use it for a calculation or doing something behind the scenes. Now, the other cool thing about arguments is they're actually published to the client. So you can actually read them and they're passed down. So when Alpha sends the information back to the web browser, it includes in there argument information. So if I go over here to JavaScript functions and I say insert method, you'll see there's one here called dialog object argument value. And so you can actually say, hey, give me the argument value for that customer ID. So if you have some JavaScript stuff that's going on there, you can say, oh yeah, I have the information in argument and I can handle it there. Now, one of the reasons that arguments are really nice is they're specific to this UX. If you use session variables, that becomes a little bit more problematic because session variables could be set, if you have two tabs open, they could be set and you start getting confusion. When it opens up one UX, it loads those variables, and then those variables are linked to that UX. So if they open a second version of that UX, the variables will be different from both. So that's one of the key valuable benefits of an argument is the fact that they're kind of linked to your current environment, the UX, and you can read and write and do things along those lines. So long-winded, but yes, when you set an argument, it is then available in the back-end processing via the get the argument function or set the argument function. And those arguments are available to the JavaScript that is running for your UX on the browser on the local device. And that is available through this here. And in fact, you can even do set argument here, and that will also set the value of the argument. So you can actually set arguments using JavaScript. Very flexible, very cool, and very handy from there. So good question. Arguments are really valuable. The more you know about them, the more you realize how powerful they are, because you have a lot more fine-tuned control over your coding and what you're doing with arguments than you do with things like session variables or setting window JavaScript arguments and or window local vars and things like that. So
excellent, thanks. You're recommending people get into arguments as
yeah,
often as
I
they
do.
can. Okay,
Well,
great.
it's that it's, polarization. Arguments are part of that. So
Back to a list discussion. There's a decode option in the list, which is new. In fact, I don't really know much about it, but apparently it also takes some sort of data source. Are you familiar with that?
I am not aware of that. This decode.
We will get
Is that
into
in
it.
that in let's see, is that in the pre-release? I wonder. It's like Decode. No, maybe it's in the latest release. Oh, let's try that.
So it's listed in field properties for a list. I don't know how new it is.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Code value. When you open a column actions. Oh, that's just a new thing or a new agenda. Export to Excel. Here we go. Is common.
Let's show that next week.
Interesting. Yeah, it's good. So this looks like an alternative to the lookup column functionality. Yeah. The trick with the lookup column is
just so you know, it's a nightly build feature. I just got clarification on that. So
yeah,
but it might still be worth looking at. Yeah,
we'll definitely dig into it. The cool thing, the thing with the lookup is you had to create a second list, have it hidden behind the scenes, put it in the right place. So there are a couple steps to get the lookup stuff to work, and it does work really well. And the beauty of it is fully offline compatible, which is very nice. But it looks like this decode values is maybe an enhancement on there. I'll check into that. I'll get off my tail and get some work done.
I also misspoke. It is in fact in production, and I'm seeing the whole thing is lighting up. People are like, "Wow, this is the greatest feature." All right, Dion, at least I'm behind the 8 ball on this one. We'll come back to you with the right answer.
You know what? So you guys don't need to know about it. So just move along.
Forget it. Yeah, exactly right. Just because everyone says it's
you don't deserve nice things.
Yeah, so it's a new feature. Why does it say 2019? I'm like, okay, thank you. All right, it's one that.
Thank you, Mr. Eagle Eye.
We'll get it. We will get. Honestly, we'll get to the full answer. Also, if again, this is for serious. If you do need to know something quicker than next week, always send us an email, guides@alphasoftware.com. We're really happy to look into these for you. Another question is, that was arguments.
By the way, the person who made that snide remark about 2019, you don't get any questions answered today.
I'm not telling you who it is. So
unless you want to get into an argument. Yeah, I know. Unless you want
it was Sarah. It was not Sarah.
She's like, hey, Beavis Butthead, I've got some information. This is in production.
There you go.
It wasn't me, but I did post a link to the documentation in the chat if anybody wants to read about it.
See,
wonderful.
Again,
Thanks
correcting
very much.
Our mistakes.
That's perfect. Oh yeah, and someone said, hey, you were talking about binding an argument to a field. How do you do that?
Yeah, good question. So when you're in here in the arguments, you first define the argument. So think of it as like creating the variable name. And when you do that, it's very important that you define what data type it is. Because later on, when you use arguments for different purposes, if you define it as like a numeric, when it builds a SQL string to query a database, it's going to use the right structure. It's not going to put quotes around it, things like that. So that's important there. Secondly is then we have what's called argument binding. So you define the argument, then you say, well, what am I going to bind it to? How is Alpha going to know what to put in that argument? And you have some different options. The first one, used most of the time, is set value at runtime. And when I click on here, you'll see that I can specify the value, and I click this drop down, it will show you a list of controls that are on your UX. So I only have one control, which is that list. And whatever the value of that list will be what is set to this argument. So the cool thing about it is that Alpha is watching these controls, and when those controls change, it's going to automatically set that argument for you. So for instance, if you have a drop-down box, someone changes that drop-down box value, behind the scenes, Alpha goes, oh, that changed. I'm going to go and put that in the argument. You don't have to worry about writing a query or doing, writing some JavaScript to make that happen. So that's option one. But again, there's other cool ways you can do it. One is get from a value, what's called a variable. And then that variable, and it's kind of in the rabbit hole, so I'll just go customer ID. That can actually be a session variable. So therefore, when this UX loads up, it goes and looks at the session variable and says, oh, okay, I'm going to put that in this argument for you. And then you can use the argument from then on. And the neat thing is that happens kind of once when it loads up, so you're good to go there. But it could be a cookie if you're managing it yourself, or a page variable. This is very powerful because, for instance, if you have this UX embedded in a page and you pass in an argument into the page, like create the URL where you go customer ID equals 12345, then when this UX loads up inside that page, it goes, oh, you know what? I see that argument, customer ID. I'm going to go get that page variable and I'm going to put it in here. And now your argument is set for you. So you can actually use URLs. And that's really cool. Like if you send someone an email and in that email you have a URL, and in that URL you have some data built into the query parameters, you can actually use that as a way to tell the UX what you want it to do. So when it loads up that page, it says, oh, I have to load up this UX. Oh, this UX has this argument. I'm going to grab it from the query parameter in the URL, put it in there, and then the system could like refresh the grid or display something or do something else from that standpoint. So this is really powerful, this variable passing. Two other ones is, again, I mentioned, if you're using the logged in user, you can actually look up information about the current user. So it knows it's johndoe@gmail.com. And then you have this other table that says the region ID is X. So anytime it loads this up, it goes and looks up that stuff for you, sets that variable. So it saves you a lot of little coding in when you launch a UX to have all that information that may be used for querying. Like if you insert a new record, you may want to insert that information. So you can set the new record to use an argument coming from the person. So it just saves you a lot of time and energy. You can also use XBasic. So when this loads up, it's going to run a little XBasic, might call a web service and then load the information from that web service into an argument. Very, very, so a lot of different, and this is over the last few years has kind of increased in capability. It used to be basically session variables and a couple other things. Now it's all these other elements there. So that, back to the original question, you would say set value at runtime, click here, select the field you want it, and then now from now on, it's going to watch that field and load the information from that field into the argument for you. And then the argument's settled at that time. Get it? We're done. We're settled. It's settled. It's in there.
Excellent. Argument
Unless
over.
someone reopens the problem, picks another record in that drop-down box, argument starts all over, but again, it's settled again there. So.
Great. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, that was, I think, a bridge too far joke.
So, never too far with the puns. So question here. This one has to do with the search part in a list control, and they're using a single keyword control to search two or more fields. But this is, and I haven't seen this question before, but is there a way to stop someone from using that wildcard percentage mark in their search?
Yeah, what you can do is that search is going to happen on a
is there an event tied to it? And could you?
Yeah, what I would do is, like, if I had it'll take a little bit. Let's say I had a text box that I'm doing that. It's just a text box in there and say search.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So what you can use is a really simple old school trick is in search parameter. There are all these events here. So what you can do is on key up, you can actually look at the key that got in. And if you don't like it, don't accept it. So actually look and say, if it's this character, it will actually pass in what key was hit. And if it's that character, you can actually just remove it so it never can get in there. So they may be hitting star, 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 but you basically kill it at the source in terms of they can't even enter that value into that search parameter there.
Gotcha. Just trap it in JavaScript.
Yeah. The other option is, the built-in search does a lot of stuff for you, but you could also, there is a JavaScript action, and that is, it's a list control action, and list customers. You can see you can do, where is it? Filter list client server side. Now this will require you to do a little more work, but in there you can add your own little special sauce to look at what the parameter is, change it before it actually gets executed. So two ways to handle it. You kind of take more control over the filtering and done there, or you can just kind of kill it at the source and not even allow them to go that put information in that field.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And there's tons of JavaScript examples out there of how to watch a key command and, and know what it is.
Yeah, good point.
ASCII code. Yeah.
Very cool. Last question. This has to do with panel cards and specifically dynamic panel cards. I don't know if you're familiar with creating a dynamic panel card, but the question is, once you create it, can you destroy it? Can you get rid of it? And how do you do it? And probably more to the point, how do you find out what its ID is so you know what to tell JavaScript what to do?
Okay, so that's going to be definitely in a lower level kind of thing. I don't think there's an action JavaScript for, let's try it here. Just see. There's panel actions. Okay, so there's the ID. You can get the panel ID and then like set a field. There we go. You can remove a panel. So I would probably look at this. So you can say remove a panel.
Yeah.
Then you tell it which panel it is and the panel number. But what's important is if this kind of looks.
The trick is when you dynamically create it, you'll need to know what its name is, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Or on a button, you would save it somewhere. Now, important thing is when you create these things, you can always convert them to, like, let me just say navigate. Oh, see, I don't have a panel navigator on there. But worst comes to worst, you can do a text mode after you create it, and it will convert it into JavaScript. And then you can look at that JavaScript, and maybe in there you could see where you can dynamically set the panel ID. So for instance, when the person clicks close, you would grab that panel ID, put it into a field, and then call a function that would then actually go look at that field, pull it out, and say, okay, this is the panel card I want removed. So I would definitely look at the action JavaScript first. Maybe you can get away with that, where it does it from there. Maybe but I haven't played with that much. That would be your first step. And then the next is to convert it into JavaScript and look at how it works there.
Terrific. So it looks like there's a request for a future webinar having to do with reading and writing from S3 buckets, which I think would be a terrific one.
I've been doing a lot on that. That is so cool stuff. It's so fast.
Great.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, I've been doing an enormous amount. It's really the way to go because the cool thing about it is that when you get going on it, you can literally tell S3, go do the work. Like, so your alpha server basically says, oh, you want this file? Great. I'm not helping you out. Call S3.
Or I'll give you the link, but that's it. Yeah, exactly.
S3 has the insanely large pipes where literally they've already predicted that you need that file and it's already on your machine. They're getting to that level of what's going on.
30 seconds before you ask for it. Yeah.
Cloud storage of files opens up so many, and there's other features that are really cool, and I can mention it when we get into it, is that you can call other services and just say, hey, this file's on S3, go do it, so you can actually tell other services the location. You have to, get credentials and stuff, but then you could actually be processing files on S3 with the alpha server just triggering that activity. And there's a lot of cool stuff there. So we can talk a little bit about that, but that's really, you definitely want to look at going to a cloud service like S3 because you'll find really cool things. And again, fast, speedy. You can also go into S3 buckets and turn on what's called versioning. So every file that gets uploaded with the same name, it actually saves a version of it. So you never have to worry about that. You delete it, it's still in the history there. So they have all these, the cloud does all these cool things for you that you just then don't worry about it. You just worry about working with the files and you archiving, backing up. That's handled automatically by the systems. And S3 is cheap. I mean, it's such cheap storage for,
Awesome. Hey, Dion,
Okay.
thanks very much. Thank you, everyone.
Yes.
We have come to the end of our time. Thanks, everyone who has showed up, asked questions, and joined us today. Thanks, Dion, for presenting. Thank you, Sarah, for giving us the correct answers there in the background. If you do have future questions or more questions, go ahead and send them to guides, GUIDES, at alphasoftware.com. And we hope to see you at our next Alpha Anywhere demo and Q&A webcast. Until then, take care and stay well. Bye-bye.